as riveting as they have been, at least from my experience. As I said, the breakout session rapporteurs, please do move close to the stage so you have an easy way to come on stage, so we have a very swift turnaround. While that happens, quick housekeeping request. As I'm sure many of you might be tempted to post on social media, LinkedIn, whatever. If you do use pictures, please make sure to check and avoid including anyone whose badge says no pictures. We should be respecting that right and make sure of that. With that, welcome back to the plenary hall after what has been clearly, what I've seen, a very rich and lively day of discussions. The goal of the next 40 minutes is to give everyone a flavor of the type of discussions, the highlights, and the observed, perhaps, tensions or commonalities in viewpoints observed through these 3 rounds of parallel sessions. So to reduce the fear of missing out, in addition to seeing the visualizations of those discussions displayed on stage as well. This is with a view to perhaps foster a shared and somewhat simplified memory of all that richness of discussion. So for this we have 2 tools. That sounds pejorative, but rapporteurs that will give very quick highlights in 2 minutes maximum. There's a timer to hold them to account, going to be displayed on the slide. And at the same time, the visual note takers summary of the conversations to further illustrate. That visualization will also feature, as will all other visual note takers, in the conference summary report to be published as quickly as we manage following the conference. Naturally, this will not do justice to the depth of discussion, but hopefully create a sense of the breadth, which might be just as important. And finally, this synthesis will set the stage for the closing panel discussion, which will pick up on some of those themes and put them into further context and reflection by a very eminent set of panelists. I'm very much looking forward to that. That's it. We can jump right in, and I'm going to invite, oh, sorry, actually, one more thing. You may remember in the morning putting a few notes into your phone on the Slido survey on the poll. This is the aggregated result of your statements in regards to the motivations of strengthening research governance. Now, this is highly aggregated, and I do believe we can and probably should include a disaggregated illustration of those answers also in the conference report, making a mental note of that to make sure. But you can clearly see, and this is not in order of the numbers of upvotes, so risk and safety concerns around slippery slope technology development and all that came very high. And then trust and transparency, so ways in which to make sure the research is actually fostering a stronger ability for, I think, governance at large to grapple with the issue of SRM and perhaps by extension climate. And then a few slightly less upvoted ones that are nonetheless clearly important. So with that, let's move on to the rapporteur's synthesis of these 12 sessions. Every one of you probably saw 3 of those, so let's make sure we get the full picture. Let's jump right in. I think, this is the overview. We'll see that again after the individual reports, and as a backdrop to the closing panel as well. Yeah, I think we won't have time to fully take that in, but perhaps you already get an impression. So I believe we will start with civil society perspectives on the next slide. That's correct. Please, who's the rapporteur for that session?
Okay, yes, so I was note-taking in the civil society perspectives breakout group, and basically the clearest tension in this group concerned whether SRM research itself should continue. So some participants argued that more research is needed to better understand the risks and inform future decisions, especially given worsening climate impacts. But others argued that research is not politically neutral and inevitably contributes to technological development and normalization. So this produced quite a deep disagreement over whether uncertainty justifies further research or instead justifies stopping SRM research now. There was some convergence around that emission reduction should remain a priority, really including global south voices and vulnerable communities. They should be central to the decision making. Current public and institutional understanding of SRM is very limited, but also a broad agreement about transparency and stronger governance is necessary as well. And then several major questions remained unresolved in this session. So a key question was, what is the actual end point of SRM research? What's the point? And can small-scale or modelling research ever truly remain separate from deployment pathways? Who gets to decide? What voices get included and how do they get included? And also what forms of governance could ever be considered legitimate or democratic across our sort of generation, but generations to come as well. And some particularly insightful moments challenge the assumption that science is neutral. So several speakers argued that research itself can shape political futures and governance trajectories as well. And I'll sort of end on the final sort of prominent moment was a statement from one participant who said, we do not have a spare planet to experiment with, which captured this ethical concern that meaningful testing of SRM may only be possible at planetary scale. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
And time. Brilliant. Thank you so much. A quick hand of applause. Thank you. And right to the next one, which is, drumroll, defining research and its boundaries.
All right, thank you. So in 1 minute and 59, I'll try and summarize what we did. So in this session, we did initially a kind of scan of the kinds of research that go into this field before getting into some of the definitions and boundaries between key concepts. So in terms of the types of research, I think as has been mentioned before, the bulk of the research in this field is modeling, which is essential to understanding the potential consequences. That modeling is constrained by our understanding of the systems, and that is improved or constrained by things like observations of natural analogs, some lab work, and potentially by field experiments, which can shine a light on particular aspects of small-scale processes. We talked about the hot topic being SRM field experiments. Crucially, these are defined by intent. The very same activity can be pursued for atmospheric research and fundamental understanding, or framed as a way to better understand potential interventions. So the very same activity, purely by intent, can be labeled differently. Another concept, deployment. Again, you could do this by intent. Some activities are to advance research purposes. Other things like make sunsets efforts to release tiny amounts of material into the stratosphere isn't for research, it's a deployment intent, but the scale is so tiny it has trivial impact. So perhaps in the definition of deployment, you might want to go to scale. Scale, For experiments, we often think in terms of, in this field, small-scale experiments today and possible large-scale tomorrow. It's worth recognizing the huge orders of magnitude difference between these small-scale activities of today and the types of scale you need to reach for deployment, which would be, in some cases, millions of times larger. And I think as you go up that scale, from 1,000,000 times smaller to 1,000 times smaller, different types of responsibilities might kick in. And as Ben pointed out, might already kick in some existing regulations at these intermediate scales. Thank you.
That is very much on time. Thank you, Pete. Next up is research ethics and integrity for SRM research governance.
Great, so this was a very varied session, so I'm not going to be able to summarize everything, but the discussion clustered mainly around the adequacy of existing guidelines for SRM research, and also the conditions of stakeholder engagement, although obviously there was a lot of interplay between these two themes. There was broad agreement, I think, that existing guidelines were good as far as they go, but required some further institutionalization. So this was emphasized at two levels. On the one hand, regional specificity, and on the other, degree of bindingness. So some participants emphasized the need for regions to develop regionally contextual guidelines. Others emphasized the need for national commissions to develop legally binding standards, on the model, for example, of the Warnock Committee or the Belmont Report. There was some disagreement on the extent to which existing guidelines were adequate. Some participants argued that we broadly know what the norms of responsible research look like, and the focus now should be building the necessary networks and capacity and institutions to implement them, while others emphasized that there was still need for further clarity at a high level, and this point of clarification before justification. So this involves, for example, prioritizing definitional questions, including the definition of research, the definition of the circumstances in which research is being conducted, including whether it's can be characterized as an emergency, and if research is to be mission-driven, the question of what that mission might be. So I will leave it there, but it was a very lively session, and we had to sadly cut it off in mid-flow.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Excellent. So next up is the role of knowledge in challenging geopolitical times.
Hopefully I can do this justice in 2 minutes. So a lot of our conversation centered around concerns that the question and role of power is frequently disconnected from much of the scientific research, and the infrastructure to address those issues has not really been built. And what architecture there is might be to mobilize that is, if not collapsing, under pressure and going through a process of transformation with unclear implications. This led to questions about which actors and ministries or departments within them will shape approaches to understanding what SRM is and how to interpret scientific research. So for two of our speakers, they highlighted that within the institutions or states that they work, the environmental ministries have minimal engagement or even resistance to engaging. And engagement comes from defense or risk perspectives, which also comprehends more than climate risks and security. And this led to another key part of our discussion, which was centered around research and analysis surfacing that climate is not the only or even the central governance issue with SRM. Questions of technological sovereignty, control, whether this is of material capacity needed for SAI, etc., or political claims of control over technology can quickly become central questions for states that must negotiate international governance. All of this raised questions about how important transparency and potentially public funding are, as well as bilateral and coalitional relationship building to avoid or prepare for non-ideal SRM. But it was very much an open question about how to ensure these things in the context of low trust international political instability, and actors who are resistant to governance or transparency, whether these are powerful state actors or private actors. So I will stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Next up, transparency of research, rationales, and challenges.
Thank you, folks. So transparency was, unsurprisingly, not treated as a single process, but a constellation of practices, openness of purpose, funding, methods, oversight, uncertainty, conclusions. Transparency is necessary but not sufficient. It can support trust, accountability, legitimacy, etc., but only when coupled with other practices such as meaningful engagement. Transparency should begin early, before activities or decisions are locked in through, for example, clear summaries, open calls, and accessible explanations. Fourth point, intent matters. People want to know not just who and what, but why, for whom, for whose benefit, at whose cost, under whose authority. Practical challenges exist and remain. SRM, for example, is hard to classify, especially when you look at the boundaries with other scientific activities. Likewise, how does one define outdoor experiment? This is a conversation that's been going on within CoCreate to quite some degree. Even something what seems as clear as transparency of funding can be difficult, but public funding has clear obligations of reporting, philanthropic funding, and especially private investment less so. Transparency can backfire. Disclosure of data without context can become mere transparency theater, and information can be misunderstood or misused. Even concerns were raised around harassment, personal safety, and exposing local communities who are involved in engagement. 2 more points. Can I do it? Monitoring is another transparency tool. Satellites and observation systems can help detect activities, but current systems are patchy and not designed for SRM. Ultimately, responsible transparency must be practical, contextual, and reciprocal, not just disclosure, but making research accountable and understandable. Thanks.
Excellent. Just a hair over time, still acceptable. Next up, societal perceptions and inclusive deliberation on SRM research governance.
Hi. I'll try to give that justice. We had different contributions from people who are either doing this for engagement or researching public perceptions and engagement. And the broad things, if you do engagement today, a lot of it was felt is more for capacity building. So to enable people to speak about it, but also to build the trust and the relationships, to also have continued engagement, which often clashes with research projects and the timelines of research projects and the time and effort researchers can give into that. What might raise some contradiction from colleagues in the project is that we also found there's a lot there that is not specific to SAI or any other SRM. So trust is always important in any kind of interaction. It's got trust in governments, and also conspiracy theories. The ones who've driven conspiracy theories, for example, in the US, and driven the legislation on the state level, are often those who come from the anti-vaxxers or the anti-G5 communities. So there's an underlying thing that's just jumping also upon weather or climate modification. So these are things that are already there, but what's also already there is there are ethics guidelines, and there are guidelines for decolonial research that can be used, that we can draw back onto. So it's not an empty space. But an important thing is something that you also might feel at this time of the day in this heat is fuzziness. Because a lot of questions that come up from participants in deliberations is, why is it important for me? Why should I spend my time engaging? And what will be the impacts on me, my family, my region, my climate, my regional climate? And often, or most of the times, we cannot answer these questions. So we have to keep them hanging a bit. And it makes it a lot more difficult to engage and build an opinion and say yes to this or no to this. I can see you and I'm done. But the fuzziness also came up in others. And who's next?
Thank you. Scientific and technical criteria for SRM research governance.
Yeah, thank you. So the evaluation of SRM field research should be integrated in governance through clear scientific criteria. And so we talked about these different criteria, and we found criteria that are actually common to any scientific research, especially experimental research. And we discussed about these, such as measurability. So we need to be able to measure the things that we want to measure, of course. We need to be able to implement these experiments in a way that they can actually achieve their goals, so respond to the scientific questions that they are supposed to address. And these are very common to all scientific research. And then we discussed 3 points that are also common a bit more in detail, such as, of course, scientific merit came up in the discussions from different viewpoints. So these should aim at improving our understanding of the processes that are at play, that are small scale, and that the global models that we use very often cannot describe specifically. And so this model experiment nexus exists, and meaning that these experiments should be also, their results should be, we should be able to integrate them in the models, and the models should be ready to use this information that we acquire possibly from these experiments, and the scientific questions should be very clear. There was slight tension on whether SRM research should be mission-driven or curiosity-driven, actually. So if there should be a kind of a roadmap of prioritized scientific questions that research should address in a kind of a sequential order or not. Stage gates or exit ramps were also addressed, and this is related to risk assessment, which is very interesting also from a research funder point of view. So what are the risks of these experiments should be defined beforehand or assessed beforehand. And transparency, just like was discussed by Jesse a while ago, it was even said that transparency should be radical for SRM. So transparency of research, full access to all data, model pipelines, and clear communication of the goals. So this really, there's a link between what was said just before. So this all applies to kind of, all scientific research, but the detail that came up is that the specificity of SRM is the need for social license. So transparency, including diverse audiences in the discussion from the beginning, and taking democratic decisions on the topic. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Next up, SRM research, risks, benefits, and governance analogs.
So, thank you very much. So we had a very interesting broad discussion about different lessons we can learn from other sectors, including everything from nuclear power to biomedicine. And so we talked about different lessons that can be learned from these examples. So I would like to leave you with 2 sort of lessons. So let's say anticipate and regulate. So what should we anticipate? Well, we should try and design governance before absolute crisis hits, right? We shouldn't wait for tragedy to strike before we start thinking about how we might need to use a given technology. Thus, the importance potentially of something like mission-driven research. Anticipate power differentials. So good intentions aren't enough in designing governance. So Florencia Luna gave us a really, very interesting example of the COVAX mechanism in COVID-19 pandemic that basically failed, even though we had good scientific evidence, good intentions, and international governance to help it work, but it didn't. Also anticipate a multitude of risks from these other examples, from the physical to the political. And then finally, regulate. So back up principles with a kind of enforcement. So an example from the biomedical field is the legal framework that accompanied the Belmont report, and that led not the principles to be accompanied with enforceable actions that meant that ultimately a common language was proposed in terms of principles, and principalism has triumphed in medical ethics for good or bad. So that's an important lesson, to get principles into the way we think about and behave. Regulate private actors, particularly rogue ones, so that should be part of that idea of enforcing principles. And that's pretty much it, really. So yeah, thank you very much.
Even ahead of time. Thank you. Finally, not sure if finally, actually, narratives and scenarios of SRM research.
Here I am. Okay, so with an interesting conversation about scenarios and narratives, mainly coming from really different perspectives. So if there's one sort of main takeaway is that everybody approaches the concept itself of scenario and their generation from sort of wherever they're coming from, right? So we heard about it from sort of a social science perspective and partly a climate science perspective, from a government perspective, from a security perspective, and sort of from a media perspective. And in all of those cases, what constitutes a scenario and what constitutes a useful scenario are really widely different things. One thing that I'd like to highlight is that whenever you end up talking about scenarios, you sort of end up in this paradox where everybody wants multiple things that tend to have some sort of tension. In particular, some of the ones that were highlighted during the discussion was the fact that on one hand, there's plausibility. We want our scenarios to be plausible, but also we want to explore the extremes, the least likely things, or maybe just the way out there things, but also what's extreme or what's unlikely might change over time. So something that you explore now and it doesn't sound like it's ever gonna happen, it might be way more likely or perceived as being way more likely 20 years from now. Same thing, sort of on one hand, there's the need for simplicity in the scenarios from especially a scientific perspective to disentangle and understand. But on the other hand, people might prefer sort of more complex scenario that yield a bit more holistic insight about all of the things because things in the real world change all the time, all at once. And lastly, there might be a tension between being inclusive in the design of those scenarios versus sort of lacking some specificity. So ultimately, the main question always remains, who are the scenarios for? And understanding clearly who are the scenario being produced for also helps with sort of solving some of those tensions.
On the dot. Incredible.
It's my only skill, basically.
Perspectives on responsible SRM research in the Arctic.
Okay, so this is the session on perspectives on responsible SRM in the Arctic, which was led by Ilona, who started the session by saying what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, which was I thought was quite a good introduction. We've got two themes going on across our presentations and questions. Firstly, around physical science, and secondly, around indigenous perspectives. And then we've got a number of recommendations for our co-create guidelines. So in terms of physical science, we had a number of options for the Arctic, in particular introduced around sea ice thickening, marine cloud brightening, and cirrus cloud thinning, and stratospheric aerosols, all of which seem to have varying levels of promise and feasibility, all of which are, to some extent, speculative, with sea ice thickening maybe likely to work locally, but overall being the most speculative option. Marine cloud brightening having a moderate feasibility, but with the modeling being very uncertain. Cirrus cloud thinning kind of being one of the new kids on the block, being quite highly speculative, but could work well potentially. Stratospheric aerosols, of course, is suggested as being one of the most highly feasible. But of course, all of these are operating in a region that's highly sensitive to changes in radiative forcing, which makes all of this very uncertain. So yeah, Arctic SRM wouldn't definitely work, but field experiments would certainly help with increasing our understanding of them. Indigenous perspective, oh God. Indigenous perspectives, we talked about the Sami, raising questions of political agency, and what would need to happen for the Sami to give the green light on experiments. Most participants in research tend to be skeptical. There are particular concerns around human and animal health, and a lot of it's oriented around traditional livelihoods, which underpin much of their perspectives, in particular around subsistence living, for example, fisheries. We have a number of recommendations, but I won't go into them now.
Excellent, thank you. Mind the Gap, SRM across the science policy interface. There's a mic there, I think. It's still there.
Hi, it was a very interesting discussion from Mind the Gap SRM research across the science policy interface. One of the central themes that came across is that trust and communication is very, very important when it comes to science and policy discussion. It also highlights the need for scientists and policymakers to better communicate uncertainties, risks, and assumption while improving mutual understanding of language, framing, as you can see, and institutional realities. There was a lot of reflections on the difficulty of translating complex scientific knowledge into policy-relevant communications, and especially within short political time frames. The importance of storytelling, communicating subtle facts, avoiding oversimplification was emphasized. There was extensive discussion around global governance and experimentation, and also the conversation explored the role of risk perception and framing. Another major theme was the challenge of building consensus and legitimacy across regions and sector when it comes to science policy interfaith-related communication. Participants also noted the importance of including global South perspectives, acknowledging skepticism around international collaboration and ensuring that governance discussions are not dominated by narrow set of actors. Finally, it's also captured the recurring tension between urgency and caution, how to create space for responsible research governance while recognizing fear around loss of control, defense and security implications, and broader societal concerns. So that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Ahead of time. Excellent. Thank you so much. Principles for SRM research, history, purpose, and limits.
I'm the one also doing that one. So the previous session I moderated, and this one I was a rapporteur for this. So just a minute, please. So one of the central themes that emerged from the principles aspect is that principles alone are not enough. Implementation and enforcement matters equally. While there is already a broad landscape of SRM governance principles and ethical frameworks, there was repeated conversation on that many remain largely aspirational without much of institutional backing, operational guidance, and meaningful compliance mechanism. There was also diverse perspectives in our room on how these principles should be actually operationalized in practice. And it became clear that reaching consensus on concrete next steps going forward is quite challenging. A second takeaway was that SRM governance cannot rely on one-size-fits-all kind of model. Participants stressed that importance of context-specific and multidisciplinary approaches that bring together legal, ethical, political, scientific, and societal perspectives. There was also recognized that governance reality differs significantly across domestic, regional, and international contexts, and making flexibility and inclusivity essential for responsible governance. So finally, the session was talking and highlighting the increasingly important role that non-state governance actors can play, including funders, research institutions, scientific communities, in shaping norm and encouraging responsible conduct. At the same time, speakers were also emphasizing that voluntary principles and self-governance mechanism cannot replace broader democratic legitimacy, legal oversight, and public accountability. That was the sense of the conversation of ours. Thanks.
Amazing, and thank you for taking the burden of reporting on 2 sessions. Very fitting. So here we have the overview here, and I have a feeling I will want to go back to this recording, and in fact you can also do that on the Climate Strategies YouTube website, you can find the recording of this recap and of the other panel sessions, just as a reminder. So with that, I want to invite my fellow panelists for this closing panel, the final part of today, except for dinner, which follows afterwards. I will, please do make your way forward. First, we have Olivia Lazard from the Berggruen Institute. I will let everyone introduce themselves because they will do so much better in regards to the context in which we're having this conversation. Next, David Awolala with the African Group of Negotiators Expert Support, AGNES. Is David here? Maybe, if not, that might be due to the fact that we have rolled up the timing a little bit on this closing panel, so we might have to start without him if that is the case, but I'm sure he will join us shortly. Then we have Julia Guivant, if I'm saying that right, hopefully, from the Federal University of Santa Catarina in Brazil. And finally, Jeroen Omen from Utrecht University. Welcome. So I will not waste a lot of time to scene set for this panel because I think the speakers will speak for themselves, first of all, and really do a much better job at connecting dots. I think there was a lot that we heard in this synthesis, in this recap of really thoughtful discussion being summarized in a very short amount of time. Some of you might have participated in some of those discussions as well. And just to set the scene very briefly then, this is not to wrap up everything that we heard or that was discussed, the issue of research governance into solar radiation modification research. Instead, I really have high hopes that our brilliant speakers will connect dots of the discussions today with broader policy contexts, both in Europe and elsewhere, and doing so based on their own perspective, their experiences, work in different fields, and again, connecting perhaps the academic world with the world of policy. Yeah, I think I will invite you, Olivia, to just get things going. Give us some of your thoughts here.
Thanks, Matthias. Good afternoon, everyone. You guys covered a lot of ground, so it's very, very difficult to sort of react and rebound in a way that synthesizes a lot of different points that you guys brought up and surfaced. But the way that I tend to think about the question of SRM and geoengineering at large is essentially that we are facing the potential of a threshold technology. If we start intervening in atmospheric systems, something that we have done, which has created externalities, but we've never done it with design before. We've never done it with a sense of, we will try and control some elements of planetary systems, Earth systems that we don't yet fully understand, but which start posing increasing risks towards us. The problem is that obviously if we head towards this scenario of threshold technology, we don't exactly know indeed what we need to govern for. We don't understand fully what we need to look out for, and we don't know what's on the other side of this. And particularly with certain forms of SAI, we may be facing indeed certain types of really long-term dependencies that raise fundamental questions of access, governance, and feasibility to maintain the systems of interference within atmospheric systems over time. And I think that it sort of rebounds quite nicely on this notion, and that was raised in a number of discussions around what is the endpoint and what is the role of SAI or SRM. Is it even going to be in relation to climate systems, or is it indeed a co-product of security dilemmas which are now playing over the fourth industrial revolution, which is the way that I tend to look at SRM. Because at the moment, what we're facing is essentially a situation in which SRM itself and any type of geoengineering writ large is now becoming a function of expansion of energy systems and technological race to AI and AGI. And on this, and I know that I don't have a lot of time, but I think it's worth, I'm sure that you guys have had plenty of discussions during the day about this. But on this, I just want to introduce something else. I think that a lot of us here are indeed approaching SRM with this notion of like, what kind of threshold technology is it? I think that there are some other people, particularly in the private sector, particularly coming from VCs, and particularly coming from Silicon Valley, who are approaching the SRM as a hedging technology, as a way to essentially sort of place bets on planetary futures upon which they're sort of planting flags already. They understand better than anyone that we've entered indeed the age of planetary security. And as a result, they're essentially sort of, trying to look at a bunch of different technological innovations, including SRM, as a way to accelerate towards AGI, which they consider absolutely foundational to the future of tech-enabled human evolution and post-planetary exits. So all of a sudden, the moment that we start looking at SRM in this light, the stakes become completely different. And I think that if we start looking at it this way, it becomes essentially a civilizational wager. We're not talking about governance understood as a technical, technocratic regulation aspect. We're talking about a vision for humanity and for the planet in the future, which is the timelines to think about how to meet those futures is becoming shorter and shorter because of tech accelerationism and because of climate accelerationism. So I think that parts of the roles of the EU in particular, European actors, as well as any nation state and civil society actor that does not subscribe to the type of planetary futures that people using SRM as a hedging technology want, the role is essentially to close the space for SRM to be used essentially as a hedging technology in the future. And that demands indeed doing a bunch of different things, which I think the EU is starting to invest into. But one of the primary things I think that needs to be instigated is indeed making sure that the space for commodification of SRM, commercial SRM, does not exist. And that needs to include countering any type of advances towards IP secrecy, demanding any type of chemical, formula related to SRM to be disclosed. If possible, to try to include elements of governance that prohibit patent applications towards SRM. Make sure that within the EU taxonomy, SRM is considered as something that should not receive any funding, that is not sustainable. And also making sure that within trade negotiations, or any type of negotiations on the basis of power dynamics today and security cooperation, SRM, especially commercial SRM, is not included as something that deserves, particular attention from an investment perspective. And in fact, deserves a lot more regulation and a lot more governance alliances around how to approach, indeed, the concept of SRM regulation and governance in the future. I'll stop there for now. I'm sure there will be questions afterwards.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Olivia, indeed. And a pleasure and an honor to also welcome David Avolala on the panel. Apologies if the shift we made caused a challenge. And in fact, I would very much like to hand you the word to also perhaps explore from your perspective. I think we heard a lot during the day about the need to be aware of context, regional context, the way knowledge is being produced, that it is responsive to the needs that also decision makers have, which I think very much fits your professional context with the African group of negotiators expert support. So feel free to take it away. Your reflections very much appreciated.
Okay, thanks, Matthias. For me, it's an honor to be in the room today to listen to various comments of SRM researchers, experts, also some policymakers who are interested in this conversation. And the issues of risk, safety, transparency have been reoccurring, and that of open engagement. So I see that there's that willingness to look for legitimacy platform through which SRM technologies could be much more made open in terms of increasing the knowledge about the technologies that could also dovetail into policy processes. Coming from a region where we have less technology capacity, because most of the technologies are coming from the north, and the south are skeptical about what is the agenda. So I would support an opinion that there should be co-creation of technology, governance issues that surrounds SRM. And SRM researchers should think beyond research questions, because we do not want SRM researchers to be conducting research because they want to solve questions that are interesting to them as researchers, but do we also have policy questions? So there is a kind of a feedback mechanism that should flow between the scientists and the policymakers. The policymakers need trustworthy evidence that can make them to make informed decisions. And when you look at the timeline of research, sometimes some of the projections we have are into the future, long-term projections. And what do we incentivize? Researchers want to make publications. You want groundbreaking, outputs, result outputs. But policymakers need specific information that can make them to make quick decisions. And if they should make bad decisions, they risk what we call reputational risk. And so for Africa, we want a capacity to be built. We want to design the research and policy agenda together. And in terms of the governance, we want a structure that every region will be seen as part of the equal agenda setter, rather than region where you want to, you see them as impact regions where you want to dump, let me use the word, to dump technologies or some of these emerging climate interventions. So, but if we feel that those who are advanced in technology can take a reverse side and let these other regions come out from regional context issues that looks at SRM interventions, not in isolation, but as part of the box of many other climate responses, then we can say, okay, SRM is part of the solutions, but not specifically a one-time fix-all solution.
Thank you so much indeed. There are already, I think, some commonalities emerging that this issue is particular in many ways, and yet it needs to be grappled with within the processes at hand, the institutions at hand that are in place to deal with both with the knowledge production and then with the policy that needs to build or connect to that. So this is really I think fitting with a lot of discussions as well that we heard throughout the day. Yeah, so I'll continue the first round and invite Julia, please, to share your reflections. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias. First, I would like to thank Co-Create for organizing this dynamic forum and so rich with ideas and food for thought in the future. And one tension that stay with me is the difference between communicating SRM and governing SRM, research responsibly. We often ask how SRM can be explained to different publics because SRM is, well, as we have seen today, it's very complex, politically sensitive, and mainly not very easy to communicate. But I think the governance question is broader because it's not only whether people understand SRM, it's also where SRM fits within different ideas of climate responsibility. And this and in this, I bring my reflection to my own research. I am an environmental sociologist in Brazil, in southern Brazil, and my current research is being done and funded by degrees, the social fund in degrees, and I have been interviewing with my team 25 until now, 25 top climatologists that are very well connected internationally. Many are involved in the IPCC and in other global scientific networks. What we found now is there is not simple a division between who is in favor or who is against SRM, but we found like a spectrum of positions among these top climatologists and with different degrees of distance, caution, pragmatic openness, and concern. The distance should not be read, I think, simply as lack of information, because many of these scientists have some kind of familiarity with SRM. So they, knowing what is SRM, more or less, they are not experts in the issue, they consider that is a secondary issue and some not neither a plan B or plan C, almost, because we found that among the majority, the moral hazard was the most important point. And so reducing emissions, protecting the Amazon, understanding climate impacts, and addressing vulnerability in already exposed areas are priorities. And so the question is, how can we integrate researchers from other parts of the world in these kind of discussions when, and not only, as you mentioned, David, not only in the perspective of capacity building, but in the case of researchers in the perspective of capacity sharing, how to include them in modeling, for example, because they are experts in their areas, and so the challenge, I think, is how to communicate with them the importance of doing or considering SRM among other priorities in relation to climate change. So the distance they have in relation to SRM is not only can not only be understood as ignorance, it's a distance that we call epistemic distance, because this is rooted, as in spite they are in these scientists are in international networks, they have some kind of principles that are shared in their climate, let's say, community research. So they share some principles about what is going to be funded, how to write calls for research, because they have, these are interesting scientists as well, because they have well contact with the ministries, although they can change with the governments, but they are very well respected among the bureaucrats, let's say, in the different ministries. And so these are key people, let's say, to speak with and to include. And it's not only, I reinforce this idea because we are speaking a lot about participation, public engagement, but who is going to be engaged, how, when? We have all these questions that have been signaled in the synthesis, and we are not speaking enough about other researchers in another parts of the world that is not only the other part of the world, is the global south. No, I think that many of us agree that it's not possible to speak about an homogeneous global south. It's very, very complex and heterogeneous. So how can, that's a challenge, I think, for the debate tomorrow, for the labs that I'm looking forward, and I think it's a very creative idea that all the group is having to present us with that space. And so not only how to discuss this issue with different kind of populations, groups, etc., stakeholders, let's say, but also with scientists that don't want to be only included, want maybe to be sharing their own capacity and their own priorities with other scientists in defining the agenda in relation to SRM, and situated in the context of the discussion on climate change. That is, of course, the priority. Thank you.
Excellent, and also thank you for foreshadowing tomorrow's discussions and for, I think, several points in regards to the fact that we, well, the we actually matters, the institutions, the actors who get to shape the research agenda and direction thereof, and that this is not a question that can be determined in blanket statements, but it's one that really is depending on the region, the nation, and the institutional landscapes is also what I'm hearing. Yeah, excellent. So last but not least, let's hear it from Jeroen, please.
Yeah, thank you. And also thank you, Olivia, for biting off a bunch of really big questions, so now I don't have to feel awkward for doing the same, for not being immediately pragmatic. But I wanted to start with a little bit of a confusion that I've been feeling for the past 24 or so hours since I've arrived in this venue. And I think, I mean, whenever you go to a conference, there's basically two or multiple conferences going on at the same time, right? You have the formal program and you have the informal conversations at the coffee table. And I don't think I've ever been to a space where the disjuncture between the two felt so strong. Because I think when Clara this morning said, well, it feels like we've been having the same conversations for 7 years, I feel like we've rehearsed this conversation that we've had today, at least the public conversation, a lot. And it's just, we're stuck in the same questions that we try to answer. But at the same time, when I'm at the coffee tables, I hear a lot of, well, let's just call it what it is, scary shit, happening outside of the purview of our typical conversation, right? And I've just been thinking about this quote the whole day that I'm going to read to you, and I'm sure all the Americans will know it, especially if you're a little bit older, because it was a really big thing back in the day, but it's from the George Bush era. It's attributed to Karl Rove, and he at some point told a journalist that journalist was living in what we call the reality-based community. A community that believes that solutions emerge from judicious study of discernible reality. And then he went on saying, well, but that's not really the way the world works anymore. We're an empire now. And when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll act again, create other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things sort out. And I feel like sort of we're stuck in being that reality-based community a little bit. We have this whole conversation about what is SRM, what is responsible research, how to define justice in this context. Well, this reality out there, this political reality that I've really not heard spoken about on stage as much as you just did, until you just did, is so fundamentally important to what is happening right now in SRM. And I think one of the things, there are many things that I could bite off here, chew off, and I want to just do one example around the question, okay, who are the actors in this space? Right? Which I think one of the things that I said this morning in my panel is I think this field is quite ahistorical and apolitical in the way that it's configured. And one of the things that it doesn't realize is that a lot of the actors that we self-evidently attribute agency to, and I'm taking the nation state now as an example, are historically contingent. And the amount of power that they have is historically contingent. And so this whole debate grew up in a time where there was a self-evidence to a liberal world order that just isn't there anymore. And I think the VC example is the most pertinent example because it's been coming up so much. It's not just a hedging technology. It's also that you see a changing configuration of state versus capital power, where you get now Palantir in the security space or SpaceX in the spacefaring space, taking up a role that would typically, historically, have been a state role. Right? So it is a state-private symbiosis. Well, it's a symbiosis only for the people who are in the sort of VC world, but they're taking over state functions. Now, we could also try to imagine maybe this is what Stardust is hedging for. Right? And this is just one of the examples. So how do we think about responsible research in a space where the world is changing this much, right? Especially, as Arti said this morning, if we're talking about a multi-decadal, multi-generational thing, the categories that we use today to understand where agency is will not be the same even 5 years from now, let alone 50 years from now. So what does that mean for how we think about that? I'll stop there because I could do this for hours.
Thanks, Jeroen. And I want to say, yeah. Thanks to all the speakers, in fact, so far, that I think there are these pockets where these topics are coming up, and also there is a reason why both of you are on stage right now, because I see this topic, this realization growing in the academic world as regards SRM research, that the context, power, changes in the world are absolutely things that need to be featuring in these conversations. And I think that is a nice segue to a question I think I can pose to all four of you, which is, in light of these developments and in light of the struggle, I would say, the fact, as Jeroen says, that there has been this conversation that seems to have been stuck and kind of the same over 10 years. What does that mean in terms of where there are actors that do hold sway, that do hold relevance still, or you know, governments do have a relevance. So the nation state is not entirely undermined, but and we also have to be mindful of where this conversation is happening. Is the conversation that's happening at the intersection between academia and policy, primarily research policy, as per the design, I think, of the project, but it's increasingly also a conversation that is acknowledging these boundary conditions and this broader context. So given all that, what are some of the most concrete levers that the different institutions or organizations either within you operate or that you are seeing in the broader landscape could be used by those entities in order to make an incremental improvement? Because after all, there's no switch to land in an ideal world. But I think we all have to operate on the assumption that things can be made incrementally better by deliberate efforts that are thoughtful and acknowledging of the context in which we operate. So what are some of the most concrete avenues of action that you can share with us today to improve the conditions and the research governance given these challenges? Is that a question that you can grapple with? And perhaps we go in reverse order, starting with Jeroen. Is that? So I know you don't like, I'm quoting you from Cape Town, you don't like to talk about solutions, but is there an action?
Well, I was really hoping that I wouldn't be the first, at least. Well, I think one part of it is also looking internally to our own debate and just recognizing in the many ways in which we are also pawns in other people's games, right? And just understanding those games and have a very serious conversation about that. The other thing is, of course, the power of the nation state and even the power of investigative journalism. It hasn't disappeared, it's not gone. We're just in a phase of reconstitution. But we all have to play our part in keeping that alive, potentially, if that's what we want. And I think, so for me, the incrementalism is really about how do it's not about SRM anymore. And I think and you also said it in your introduction, and there's something special about SRM, and sure, there is something special about SRM in the intent of deliberately modifying the Earth's systems. It's not, I mean, there are other technologies that do that too, but maybe not at this scale. But by insisting on how different this is, we risk having the conversation just about SRM. And so for me, the things where I think, well, what can we do to make the world or this conversation incrementally better? Well, it's really about, well, let's talk about the power that VCs have in general. Let's talk about big tech in general. Let's make sure that we have a much more mature conversation about what we can and cannot do with science in society. Because a lot of the controversy and a lot of the polarization within the field, and I think also on the topic outside of the field, is just because there's a lot of misunderstanding of what science is and can be in society. So, I mean, I said to Herman before this, I'm the wrong person to ask this kind of question because I think on 30 or 50-year timescales, right? So I don't know what to do tomorrow. I'm thinking, how do we set up a cultural movement around this?
Julia.
Okay. I don't agree so much with the idea that we are so much stuck in the same discussion. I think it's important to have these discussions about public engagement, about who, when, what, etc. All these questions, because I think that social scientists, speaking as one, we have I think, arrived to this discussion about SRM quite recently. And the experts in SRM, modeling, etc., climatologists that are working on SRM, have not assumed an interdisciplinary perspective, maybe, no? So I think that the interdisciplinary dialogue is not exhausted already. There is much space to occupy, to develop, and we are doing that. No, I feel glad that I am a social scientist working with social studies of science, environmental sociology, etc. I'm participating and listening and having these different talks, in the coffee breaks, etc. So, and there is a lot to be working still on these issues. To be pragmatic about this issue is very important, not to be repeating the idea of a public engagement, for example, because that's not, we can't be romantic about this idea. We need to be very realistic of the limits that not everybody would like to participate, not everybody would like to, is motivated to be engaged. And sometimes who wants to be engaged are people that have their own agenda. So we need to be careful about that. Who is going to participate? Who is going to be involved? And, but I agree that the geopolitical landscape is very, very uncertain. And it's very dangerous, it's very conflictive, and we don't have the same multilateral countries negotiations spaces that we had before. And so this is a challenge for governance. Who is going to govern this? Which is the institution? Which is the forum? I think that is really difficult to see, which are the big structures that are going to be doing that. And so I think that, of course, we need to be careful, and the plans can't be for a long term, although there is the need to think in the long term, but things are changing a lot. And one of the sessions I was today was about narratives, and I don't remember her name, but this journalist was from Switzerland. I don't know if she's here now. And she mentioned that, and asked, I think it was her that asked in another session, the role of fake news as the media. It's so important today, and the role of because when we say, no, nobody knows about SRM, it's not quite correct, because we have Instagram groups, for example, or Facebook groups, etc., about chemtrails in Brazil with more than 4,000 followers. And these are global networks speaking about chemtrails. And so I think that as well, that's we are not speaking in an empty space, and we are speaking in a conflictive and diverse and very uncertain world. But that doesn't mean we need to be paralyzed about how to reply to this.
Yeah, I think one theme that I'm hearing in this, in perhaps between Jeroen's and Julia's responses, is that we have also a bit of a clash between an ideal sort of an idealist approach, if I can put it that way, in describing governance ideals on the one end, how this whole issue should be tackled, and then on the other end, quote-unquote reality, or just a much more complex landscape of real institutions, actors, individuals coming together and co-creating in here, but also more broadly interacting. And this is a much more messy picture that I think it's important to acknowledge that we have these two poles oftentimes, this abstract and the real world. And I do think that there is movement. So I see many of these points. So yeah, over to you, David, please.
Okay, for me, I see two pathways to improvement. From developing country perspective, in order to not to see SRM interventions as distraction, there's a need to have a community of practice. Why do I say some felt SRM is a distraction? Developing countries, they have certain expectations from global north regarding their international climate commitments. In developing countries currently, there is so huge climate change literacy. I mean, climate change illiteracy, rather, is so wide compared to your own region. Because I heard you said you have large community where you're on Instagram and you share information, which is super good. But in many developing countries, we don't have that. There are still a lot of misconception about what is climate change. And now we are going a little bit higher, talking about things that are even beyond either adaptation or mitigation. So poverty, issues of loss and damage, technology transfer, capacity building, and climate finance are the priority for many developing countries. So how can we bring in the conversation of SRM interventions to address some of these issues? For example, what would be the cost of SRM deployment, the technologies? What are the benefits? Who gains from such technologies? Who control the benefits? In terms of permission to deploy, who owns the rights to permit deployment? These are issues that can easily be addressed when we have a community of practice. So right from designing interventions, why can't we have the scientists in the room, the practitioners, the private sector, the policymakers, as well as the policy takers as well, who are perhaps vulnerable, marginalized communities? Why can't we have an open engagement where we can co-design some of these ideas? And secondly, the second pathway is about data sharing. And I might want to say something that maybe my colleague might react to since he comes from UCT. Do we really think about issues of ESG principles, ESS principles in SRM research? Because these are issues of citizen science that should be bothering to us. And so in most of the data gathering scenario developments that most of the SRM experts have been conducting, the question is, who owns the data? Do different regions have access? Do they have control on what they do with the data? You see? So currently we do not have sufficient information about the economic assessment of SRM technologies. We don't have it. Either economic modeling and the risk assessment, the environmental impact assessment studies, do we have them? We don't. So we still have a long way to go. But if we can follow this path, for us from developing countries, it's really important to us. And these are issues that can strengthen the trust between the policy and research, because currently there's a disconnection. Policymakers are doing their own thing in silos. Researchers are also, moving forward with their groundbreaking scientific discoveries, which is fine. But the research outputs, are they responding to the needs of the society, the needs of the policymakers, who are the ones to take decision? Scientists would not take decision on deployments. It is the policy that takes decision. And for them to take decision, they need credible evidence that are grounded regionally and that are open to explain risk and benefits.
Thank you. And Olivia, please jump right in. Thanks.
I want to acknowledge that we're having two parallel conversations on the panel. And I think it's important to recognize this in order to have a mental model that allows us to address the various sort of questions that come from these two discussions. I think that what Jeroen and me are trying to bring up is that there is a mobilization of actors with tremendous capabilities in financial, political, military, economic, cultural, information terms that are now actively entering, have been entering the space regarding geoengineering conversations. And geoengineering is situated on their maps within a larger project. It is not an end in of itself, it's a means towards a greater end. That end is the civilizational project that I was talking about, which is about going beyond the confines of the planetary. Those actors recognize planetary boundaries. They understand planetary boundaries. Those actors have access to tremendous modeling capabilities. And they understand, it's even in their discourse, if you hear a person like Peter Thiel, his entire ideology hinges on the notion of entropy and stagnation, which needs to be fought against. And fighting against entropy, including at planetary level, includes accelerating, providing and giving every single means in terms of investments towards technological innovations that will take humanity, not necessarily humans as we understand them today, as we've been understanding humanity for the last 12,000 years. The project is to create a different kind of humanity which not everyone has access to, and which not everyone will evolve towards. And parts of the future of civilization, the way that they understand it, will maybe stay on this planet, or maybe will evolve towards something completely different. Think of singularity rhetorics or narratives coming from Kurzweil. Think of extraterrestrial conquests, like, you know, a la Elon Musk, who has mused about geoengineering, space-based geoengineering, or Altman, who's in charge of the Stargate project, who has also mused about geoengineering, again, as a technology that helps to gain time in order to evolve towards AGI, so that AGI helps humanity evolve towards a different dimension of its history, of its biological evolution. The other conversation that David and Julia are bringing up, and which like a lot of different panels or groups have been discussing, have to do with a conversation about SRM, which has been historically tethered to the climate conversation and to how to manage climate risks. Knowing that a lot of previous steps regarding, or before essentially considering the deployment, the research, but potential deployment of SRM, such as how to navigate transition risks, how to navigate derailment risks, have not been had. So we're incredibly late, essentially, in terms of how do we even try to create governance systems, mapping exercises, alliances that help us to understand how to accelerate towards an energy transition and more largely climate-related transitions that are effective, right? But on the thing that I think connects the two is the notion of, if there is a civilizational wager on the one hand, coming from techno-accelerationists, who, by the way, are also techno-fascists, if there is a civilizational wager coming from them, the question is, what is the alternative? What is the other vision for the future of the planetary? knowing that the future involves essentially some kind of equilibrium, some kind of balance, not just between nation states, which are increasingly being hollowed out, as you were saying, Jeroen, and which are being transformed by climate change, by anthropogenic change, by economic change, by technological change, and which are now being reconfigured into central stacks. This is the operating word for the US and for China, which are essentially driving us towards a fundamental redesign of the geopolitical and geostrategic system. So in this context, where we have a fundamental redesign of geostrategic systems, what do polities such as the EU or nation states like Brazil, which are facing debt issues and therefore investment issues and therefore competition issues, how do they position themselves? Not just against this other project. What do they stand for? How do they align in terms of alliances? What do they discuss? Why is SRM important to discuss within, for example, the context of mineral partnerships between, for example, the EU and Brazil, or EU and Norway, or EU and Canada? How does talking about SRM help us understand the new geostrategic context that we have to navigate, and therefore that we need to defend ourselves from, knowing that in any case, the notion of the nation state is probably not going to stick around for that much longer, because everything is changing anyways. So the question is not about maintaining policies that they have existed, but how we can essentially adapt and what role, if any, SRM plays. And on this, and I'll just finish there, when we talk about SRM, my experience is that it quickly moved indeed in the last 10 years from a solution of last resort to something which is now considered potentially an enabling technology for CDR to scale, for the energy transition to scale, for all of these different things, right? But I don't see any other technical proposition in terms of alternatives. However, what we're not giving enough credit to, and where indeed modeling and planetary sapiens can help, and the EU is extremely well positioned to cooperate with countries like Brazil, with African countries, with other middle powers. I know that this word is contested, but I'll use it just for now. How do we work on complex regeneration? How do we work on understanding better planetary interdependencies, ecological interdependencies within and between ecosystems? How does that, create a new visual map, a new geopolitical map of what we need to invest into, how we need to play with or invest into better understanding atmospheric rivers, trying to sort of bring back stability of hydrological cycling, and therefore greater cooling potential, greater adaptive potential, greater mitigation, dividends, et cetera, et cetera. These are some of the things that the EU in particular, if it has to sort of, arbitrate in terms of budgetary decisions, especially as we are against the clock in terms of the multi-annual financial framework, which is coming up next year, how do we invest essentially into different types of modeling? What are the alternatives, and how do we resource them so as to say to the other people, no, this vision that is being entertained in terms of post-planetary exits, transhumanism, this is not the majority project, and other polities will stick behind a different vision and will resource the investments in terms of modeling, in terms of experimentations, in terms of alliances, and in terms of new adaptive potential to go in a different direction.
That was a lot. Thank you very much indeed. I think, yeah, we peeled through a lot of layers here. It's going to be impossible to summarize, so I'm not going to attempt that, but I do want to give the opportunity for the room to engage with this conversation also. We are approaching time very quickly, so let's jump right into that and have perhaps, Julia, you can loop an answer into a response to a question from the floor, if that works. Do we have? I see one hand up front.
Thank you. a lot to think about. With this transhumanism story, the way I look at this is that you are making this, the SRM, an integral part of the context, right, of the SRM. But I would say, well...
Situated within their map. It's not the central argument. I situate it within their map, but I don't put SRM at the center of the project.
Oh, what is really a part of the project? That's what you say, right? And I would say, well, it will be the task of, let's say, us in the EU and elsewhere across the globe against the Silicon Valley boys, that we should change their context. Because SRM is really... Oh, that's better. Because, well, again then, on the one hand, I see the context of the technological, the power of the Silicon Valley boys, and I see SRM, which started as a climate intervention technique. And I think it should stay there. So it should remain a climate intervention technique, which means that we should have all the political power that we can mobilize for this to change this context from the Silicon Valley development over there. So remove the power of, if we can, from the Peter Thiels, the Elon Musks and all those guys. And I think this is starting now. So the realization that we are too dependent on them has started, and we try to get the power back again. So I'm not really sure how your vision for the next decades will hold, because we do already see a political movement that, well, we have to reduce their power and we have to put regulations in place to minimize it more. So, well, I'm not sure, this is not a question, it's more like a remark before we go for dinner.
So in other words, I think if there is a question, it's about the how to deal with the challenge that is being described in terms of power, questions of empowerment of legitimate actors at the same time, legitimate knowledge, if that's a concept. Yeah, perhaps we get a couple of questions and then have the panel respond as also the final set of statements. Thanks, go ahead.
Thank you. I want to sort of, in the discussions that I heard today, I also felt like when it comes to proposals of research governance, there's two kind of different accusations that are thrown at those that try to imagine a positive version of research governance. One of them is that we don't engage with realities of political power, and the other one is that sort of like we're too naive, right? Like those are the two kinds of one. But based on what you two said, I would say that there is other ways in which that can be interpreted, where this kind of naivete, this kind of wish that actually positive research governance can do something good, can be part of your vision for the overall, right? So in this, I would like your comment about, again, is it possible, do you think that it is possible indeed to integrate this positive version and say, we want to be against those kind of, techno-fascism by being their watchdog through our research? So that's sort of my question or provocation, maybe.
Thanks, and perhaps one third question. I saw David near the speaker on the right. Yes.
Thank you. Yes, David Santillo from Greenpeace. Oh, I'll probably get feedback from the speaker. It's just a simple question. Should we stop talking about building trust? And is there something instead that we should be doing? I'm not sure you can build trust, and if you try to build it, very often it backfires because people don't trust you. So is there something that should be done in order to earn that trust? And what are we earning trust in?
So if I'm to recap the three questions into almost a similar one, I think, first, given power differentials and challenges around power, how can, and I'm lumping Daniela's question into that, research governance be a tool for empowerment of legitimate actors? And the question on trust, I think, links to that, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of, well, knowledge is power, and therefore the way knowledge is produced is a tool of influence into this world, and this can be approached better or worse in different ways. So I'll leave that with the panelists and invite them to use that as their set of final remarks.
Okay, for me, to build trust, it's good to co-create, to design the research policy questions together. It won't serve any good when research had been done, completed, validated, published, and then we take a kind of summary or policy brief after the research, and we say, okay, now it is the turn of the policymakers. Now we want to go and engage them. So it will look as if the aspect of governance is an afterthought because the research had been done, completed. But in a situation where you have everyone, being brought on board together to design what do we really need? What are the policy questions or the decision questions that the scientists are supposed to respond to? And then we could create a kind of an agenda, research agenda together. And that is why issue of power and control that we mentioned also influences transparency. If those who have the technologies, those who have the capacity are transparent enough, or they're willing to be transparent enough, then capacity sharing that she mentioned comes into play. So no region wants to be seen as a kind of a recipient of technologies or innovations around climate interventions because it affects the economy, it affects the entire human system. And so they want to be a part of the design right from the beginning. So that would be my comment on that, that industrialized countries, developed countries who have the technology, because we really need the technology, we really need it, but you want others to trust you and then bring them on board right from the beginning. Issues that concerns data sharing, issues that concerns environmental impact assessment perhaps, and ESG safeguards are needed to be co-designed right from the beginning of the research, not at the end of the research. And then what should be communicated as well should be in language that could be understandable. And I will also emphasize my last word, we need locally led research, because research agenda could come from anywhere and fly into the region and are not context specific to the region's regional issues at hand. But can we have homegrown research where indigenous knowledge system comes to play, where marginalized societies, vulnerable communities are part of the design? So with that, I think once we have such kind of an agenda setting, trust can be built, transparency can be accepted, and we will be conducting research that is socially acceptable.
Thank you. I'm inviting any of the three remaining panelists also.
I only wanted to say that what Olivia mentioned about, I think it's, this is a very interesting debate, very good. And it's difficult to put an end word on this to finish. But I don't really agree with this big picture that we have a new kind of humanity coming, the future of civilization, it's at stakes. It sounds, in some way, this project that you are describing sounds like very conspiratory. And I couldn't avoid to feel like a puppet in that description, no? Or we are like puppets in discussing small issues when the big issues are out there, arranged by a couple of people together in a room or online, let's say, whatever. But I don't have that impression, because what you are describing is a kind of as conspiracy theory without clear demonstration, without clear data. It makes sense in some way for you or for you, but it doesn't make sense for me because all conspiracy theories have elements of truth. And they are believed because they mix elements. But I agree more with the messy perspective of the world. I like that word for our world. It's messy, it's conflictive, but there is not some people might have a plan, a project, the project, but it's not, they are not the only ones that have a project, and they are not the only ones that have the power. There are other powers in conflict. So I think that the picture is very complex, much more complex than that. Maybe there are some actors that would like to manipulate the world, of course, always have been, but I think that this meta-narrative of history, where it is going, it sounds very much like the narratives of the 19th century. No? This perspective that the future, we don't know. The future is not determined, and nobody will determine it although they try. It's not possible because there are many forces in conflict. So I use that my time, sorry, I'm not replying to all the questions, but I think that it's important to address this difference between a plan and between a messy world, no? Where plans can be planned, but not really implemented as people, these planners would like. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity for the debate.
I'll reassure, just an anecdote. Most of the time when I go for drinks with my friends or my family and they ask me, what do you work on at the moment? And I talk about technofascism, technotranscendence and things like this. They sort of sit there silently and they're like, has she gone completely cuckoo? So I empathize with your family. But as you seem to empathize with my family, I empathize with your reaction. And maybe it helps also to sort of like situate my own professional bias. I'm a peace and security practitioner. I come from working in conflict zones at the beginning of my career and then sort of focusing mostly on the fact that the energy transition and the digital transition have been understood as technical matters, when in fact they were the vessels for a power and geostrategic transition. And that we now find ourselves, and this is very apparent, in a moment of history, what I think indeed is a civilizational juncture, not just a historical juncture, but a civilizational one, where security dilemmas are essentially sort of, like manifesting over fighting over the substrates of societies, energy, materials, ecological foundations. We tend to think that powers don't think about them, that the likes of Trump do not care about climate change or things like this, but when you hear them talking about climate change in terms of its impacts regarding Canada or Greenland, it doesn't quite fit the picture of a person who's a climate denier. And we're also fighting about the horizons of the technological transformations that are playing out in economic spheres, in cultural ones, partially related to conspiracy theory spreads, right? How to use information manipulation, information environment engineering to try and sort of create cleavages and disruptions within coherent polities, within democratic polities as well. Right? And when I observe essentially, because I didn't come here to talk about the whole techno-fascist project, and obviously like, your point is well taken that I didn't have the time for demonstration, but when you look essentially at some of the personalities and some of the actors, VC actors, positioning themselves on techno-military industrial complex transformation, acquisition of land, manipulation or sort of, like designing of certain governance space related to climate action, including around CDR, acquisition of certain types of technologies and investment in technologies which have to do with agri-tech and biotech, with transhumanism, with longevity, with weather modification, with climate modification and other forms of planetary modification, you start wondering why we're looking at all of these ecosystems of investments and actors in silos, when in fact, when you look at them as a whole, there's a different picture that emerges. Now, you raise another point, which is absolutely fair. There is a difference between a plan and a plan that works and gets implemented. On this, what I will answer is, with people who have acquired political power, military power, technological power, financial power, however bonkers their own vision is, we can't afford not to look at them and not to take them seriously. Whether or not they will eventually manage, whether or not even the notion of techno-transcendence is feasible, is a different matter. And this is why I was insisting on the fact that there needs to be a different kind of organization of the actors that still want SRM to stay tethered to the climate space. Something which is essentially, which requires honest, authentic, triangulated, transparent, ethical, responsible research. Which is why the EU and other actors that do not subscribe to any type of vision like this need to demolish the space for commercial SRM. Demolish it by any means possible. And then the rest is essentially, and this is why we have a weird convergence at the moment, if we want this to happen, we also need to look at the role of DG Comp, for example. Not just DG Klima or DG Env or EAS, and I will finish on this.
But also, perhaps for the audience that's not familiar with EU institutions, the spelling out.
DG Competition. The directorate which is in charge essentially of competition matters. DG Comp has a role to play in looking now at SRM and saying, are we facing a risk regarding some kind of either actor or ecosystem monopolization? Which creates economies of scale, which will mean that honest researchers who are coming to this topic with honest intentions will be paper tigers. This should not happen. This is something that we should avoid, and there's still time to make sure that this is avoided. And I'll end on this. Yehoon, I'm sure you'll have plenty to say.
Thank you very much. And I think one of those points resonates with what I heard from David as well, which I think I hope everyone in this room also agrees with, is that decisions on the issue in the end won't be in the academic space. And I think this is an assumption that has been clear for a long time. But at the same time, I think there are questions as to how the academic space is structured, given the backdrop that you're describing, which very much looks at power, which I agree is an important thing to do. I would perhaps not do it exclusively, but I see the urgency in that regard.
Just to be clear, again, the message is that's what I was trying to say. There's a difference between the technological threshold research with all of the stuff that comes with it and the technological hedging strategy. The technological threshold needs to be looked at, needs to be investigated. Personal disclaimer, I don't really fancy a future in which we deploy SRM, but that's coming from a place of non-scientific understanding, right? Or non-scientific research, just security research. What I do know is that the actors that are organizing on the other side are likely to crush the space in which honest researchers get organized. That needs to be avoided.
Thank you. That was actually very clear, indeed, a great summary. With that, Jeroen, last words.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to just take the questions from the front. After, I do want to stress, when I listen to both of us saying, I don't think either of us makes any claim about what will happen. Right? We're making a claim that specifically departs from that notion of messiness. I also deliberately, and I'm coming to your point, Herman, avoided to go specifically into the techno-fascist. And I'm just saying powers as they are structured today are historically contingent and they're being renegotiated. And yes, I think there's an enormous mobilization of power, money, all of the things that you mentioned on the tech fascist side. And I think that's probably the most important thing to keep in mind at this particular juncture in time. But I think the question, I guess, on all of our minds related to SRM is how do you tether this to the climate, right? That's what you said. How can we make sure that this maintains its status as a climate technology? Well, I think the very first thing that we need to recognize is that the climate as a concern is not a homogeneous concern either, right? It is potentially a very securitized concern, as we just heard in Olivia's, implicitly in Olivia's contribution. These climate deniers are simultaneously making bets on resource futures in the Arctic, in Greenland. They're not deniers. They are definitely thinking about something else as well. So you can have a climate policy, you could have an SRM tethered firmly to climate that simultaneously is deeply fascist. And I think one of my PhD students is researching circular economy, and she was reading this book called Empire of Rag and Bones, and it's about Nazi Germany. That is basically doing circular economics on all the same sort of premises of resource autonomy, resource circularity that we now preface in circular economics, but does it as a sort of integral part of war effort and genocide. So just tethering it to the climate is not enough. And so that, I think, is also the question that I wanted to answer to you, Daniela, is how can we, if we want to have a positive effect on this? I'm sure that every single person in this room believes in the power of doing positive work. Otherwise, I don't think I'd be here anymore. And I know that a lot of people who I agree with typically are also still here all the time. But it cannot be by simply accepting the status quo as it is and having this, yes, naive conversation without including power structures and how power structures remake not only what we can do, but also fundamentally what we consider to be normal, what we consider to be desirable. And I think that conversation needs to somehow be internalized in research governance. And I don't know how to do it. I'll leave that to you.
Thank you, Jeroen. That sounds like homework to me. And that's a great note to end on and also give a quick outlook to tomorrow. But before I do that, I do want to thank the panel very much for the very rich and very engaging conversation that definitely has peeled a lot of layers and is definitely thought-provoking. I would try to anchor, perhaps attempt to anchor one concept that I'm hearing cutting across this, in this question of power, agency, and on the other side of that, resignation, which can also be a risk in this, where I think we do need to, no matter how we look towards the future, the way we imagine the future is a very powerful thing. That shapes, I think, our abilities to make a difference. And I do want to land on that also, that point, Jeroen, you just made. I think we all here are looking to make a difference and actually trying to grapple with complex questions governance of research on this issue being one that we have chosen to focus on. And on that note, tomorrow we'll get a chance to do that a lot more still, with hopefully a lot more specificity even, focusing on the question of what needs different types of stakeholders have on that issue, those that are looking to make a good, positive impact, and then how can we, basically to make it really specific, how can this co-create project help answer some of those needs by providing structure and ideas in our work that might help take things a little bit forward to not remain stuck in this complex issue. And so on that note, if we could have the last slide to show, just for a bit of housekeeping. Dinner is awaiting us at 7:15 at Bouillon, Bruxelles. You can see the address. You can also get the Google Maps directions by scanning the QR code. And I also want to say, encourage everyone to come back here tomorrow at, I think, 9. We will be starting 9:30 tomorrow, so be back at 9:15 if you want to grab a coffee and get ready for the, well, to work, essentially, to work out some of these questions in the co-creation labs. And with that, I don't want to hold us back further. You have two options. You can either go back to your hotel until such time as dinner is ready, or stick around, engage in continuing conversation, or answer some emails and then walk over, or maybe find a bar nearby is what Daniele, I think, is saying. So feel free, choose your own adventure. And again, thank you to our panelists. A big round of applause.